Hey guys, Yan here, and welcome back to the Emporium of the Weird. So in January, I had a conversation with author and lawyer Steven Raaymakers about his upcoming series of Sword and Sorcery books called Scars of Magic. This is an anthology of stories, all beautifully illustrated by Rafaela and Daniel Happy. I hope I didn't butcher that. There were some audio issues during the recording of this interview. I tried my best to fix it, so if there are times where the audio sounds a little bit weird, that's probably why. This was a great conversation, and I really hope you enjoy it. So without wasting any more time, let Steven Raaymakers introduce himself.
I'm a fantasy author, as well as a commercial lawyer by day, and I've written one trilogy called The Aria of Steel, which started around 2018 and finished, I think, 2022. So that was kind of a general fantasy, and now I'm working on Scars of Magic, which is a sword and sorcery / horror fantasy kind of book. And that's a 6-book series with about 46 short stories.
Alright, brilliant. And obviously, I mean, you say yourself that you were a lawyer. How do you balance that sort of that workload with being an author?
Yeah, it's a bit tough. I have to say, I don't write on weekdays, but weekends I'll wake up at 5:30, and smash out a couple of thousand words usually. I have to admit, I'm pretty lazy when it comes to working outside of my career. So things take time, and good things take time.
Yeah, absolutely. What's actually fun? I just realized this right now. A lot of authors were lawyers as well. I just realized that I was reading. I'm blanking out on the name, but I have an anthology, Swashbuckling Adventures. It's a really good anthology. I recommend it, and quite a few of them used to be lawyers, which is interesting.
Yeah, the big one is John Grisham.
Obviously, without giving too much away, how much can you tell us about Scars of Magic, sort of the character in the world?
It's set in a world of giant craters, essentially, which happens during an apocalypse, a magical apocalypse, rather than a nuclear or biohazard kind of apocalypse. And each crater has its own ecosystem, its own seasons, its own creatures as well. Our main character, Astera State, is a kind of middle-aged woman who wanders through these craters, doing various odd jobs and really just wandering and making a living as she can. Her right arm is corrupted by the magic, and so it hangs basically limp and dead for the most part. She has a sling attached to her, and she just leaves it in there. But when she needs to, it becomes a weapon of incredible power, and she kills whatever she wants, pretty much with unlimited power. And the issue with that is that it spreads up her arm each time she uses it. So her main worry is that it's going to consume her entirely and kill her in the end. So she doesn't use the magic as much as she can, but she's a pretty good fighter and stuff with her one arm, and she's incredibly agile as well. I did a lot of research into actually disabled athletes. It's incredible what they can do. A lot of them are a hell of a lot more fit than I am, and the things they can do. They can do archery and everything. I can't comprehend it. I did archery myself in the past, actually, and I can't even hit the target. These athletes with one arm or no arms even hitting bullseyes. So it's pretty incredible, pretty inspirational stuff if you look into it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think that's the one thing we spoke briefly about it. That what we love about this is that sort of that great power corrupts all in a way. And I don't know if she's necessarily an evil character necessarily, but there is a cost of her having this ability. In theory, there would be a point where she just can't move, essentially.
And the question is, what happens to her heart when that happens? Like, does that die as well, or her mind,
This is a post-apocalyptic magical world. I guess that did give you sort of more freedom. You weren't sort of tied, because I think post-apocalypse is kind of like sci-fi, where it is sort of tied into like logic and science and stuff that's kind of been proven. Whereas with this, you can kind of go balls to the wall.
Yeah, you can do anything. I mean, that's the wonder of fantasy compared to sci-fi. And I love sci-fi. I read a ton of sci-fi. I think I read more sci-fi than fantasy. But that freedom to do absolutely anything with completely free reign leads to amazing books. You've got things from Tolkien to Conan to Solaris to all the various authors around the world making completely fresh worlds like Earth, Sea, and things like that. Narnia, the list goes on and on and on. Whereas sci-fi, you do have those constraints. So it's a nuclear apocalypse. That means you've got radiation. How do characters deal with that? And you have to make sure it's correct. Otherwise, the readers are just pulled directly out of it. Whereas fantasies, it's quite hard to pull a reader out of a fantasy. If you write well, you can pretty much pull off anything.
Yeah. And I think this is another thing we did also kind of speak about was, like, for example, Howard, he would use a lot of history to make his world believable. For your world building, what were sort of your main elements or your main inspirations in creating Scars of Magic?
So I did a bit of research into, survivalism and, how you would survive any kind of apocalypse, how you survive in the wild. And my main inspirations also come from kind of broken down, dying worlds like Bloodborne and Dark Souls and things like that. I'm a big fan of Paul McCarthy. He wrote The Road and Blood Meridian. And his books is very dark, and it's all about surviving in like the most brutal conditions. And while I didn't go quite as far as Paul McCarthy does in terms of the violence and the horror, it definitely coloured my world a bit, and it lent it a kind of reality, because humans struggle throughout life, no matter where they are, no matter what they're doing, no matter how wealthy they might be, or how healthy they might be. Everyone has their own personal struggles, and it doesn't matter, if it's a fantasy world or a real world or a sci-fi world. There's always a way to make that connect with the reader, and I think I've achieved that.
Right. And we did also speak briefly a little bit also, but with the monsters, obviously without giving too much away, but obviously monsters that inhabit your world. Took a little bit more freely with them. You didn't borrow as much from our own world, from our own mythology. You kind of did your own thing.
Yeah, so I don't actually use dwarves or elves, or goblins or dragons or griffins or anything like that in any of my books. I try to steer clear of that, because it's not the kind of fantasy I enjoy reading. I think Tolkien is the only author who I let get away with that for my personal reading list. But usually I try to stick to more human elements. Now with Scars of Magic, I did want a more alien kind of world, and that included all the weird creatures which I've created for that, which include a Mishtan, which are three-headed kind of lizard creatures who are incredibly intelligent and hint at having a hive mind. And there are various other creatures which existed before humanity in this world. So it adds an air of mystery and kind of ancient malevolence, perhaps, which I really enjoyed writing, and I really enjoyed hinting at all the things which do come together later on in book 5 and 6. So yeah, I enjoyed that. I love making new monsters.
I suppose, like, when you are trying to have more of that traditional fantasy, you're always going to be compared to Tolkien in a way, because he is sort of the standard almost. It was sort of a trade-off then, isn't it, going that route, too, because you are making something new, so the comparison dies off, but it is also very difficult, I would assume.
You've got no building blocks, you're trying to do something different, which is always going to be a challenge.
So obviously you wrote some previous books in the past. You wrote obviously the trilogy. What have you learned from that experience of plotting and planning out, and what have you applied to this new series of books that you are making with Scars of Magic?
So my first trilogy, I wrote book 1 not even as part of a trilogy, but it did leave open a lot of questions which I would needed to answer. I did wind everything up quite neatly and tie it all in a bow at the end, but I think that's something I took on board with Scars of Magic. And what I've done with Scars of Magic is actually write all of the stories before even considering publishing book 1, because I wanted to make sure that there is consistency there are no plot holes, and that the character arcs, which develop throughout the stories, do serve a greater purpose, and there is some kind of emotional payoff at the end. Book 6, I think, is going to be quite scarring for a lot of readers because a lot of stuff happens. Most of it unexpected. Not because everyone just dies, I'm not going that cheap route, but I'm rather making sure that all that emotion, which is built up over 5 books, is just absolutely hammered at the end. And I really enjoy doing that to readers. My wife reads a lot of the short stories before they even hit the publication stage, and she's often crying either happy or sad as what's happening. I really enjoy that. I'm not a masochist. Seeing that emotion, that I can actually, the words that I've taken from my brain and put on paper, is making someone cry it's a weird feeling of like, wow, like I've actually got a story to tell, and it's worth it.
Has to be a good feeling, yeah. I remember I was reading a sort of King's memoir, I think, on writing, and I think he was very similar. Like he took his wife's opinion very seriously, and he, that's sort of the one person he takes feedback from. So yeah, there's that similarity then, eh?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I read a ton of Stephen King when I was younger, and I still read now and then. He's very good at what he does. Huge inspiration, especially in the way his stylistic techniques, like putting characters' thoughts in italics. Not many authors do that exact style, but that's something I instantly adopted from King, and I use in all my books.
Stephen King was, I think, one of the very few writers I actually read in school, because I obviously grew up in the 2010s, for better and for worse, so YouTube was my main thing. Unfortunately, yeah, it's that thing, right? But I remember when I read Misery, that was one of the very few books in secondary school where I was like, oh my god, I read from the beginning to end, and I was absolutely blown away. And then obviously Howard came along, and then he's the reason I'm even here now. So, and I guess I forgot to ask that sort of at the beginning, but what was your sort of siren call to Sword and Sorcery? What was that book, film, or whatever that got you into this genre?
Conan the Barbarian, 1982. I probably shouldn't have seen that when I was about 5 or 6. It made an impression, I'll tell you that. The music and the acting and the violence, like, it's so good. And it's kind of a B kind of movie, but it hits, like, better than any other movie I've seen, fantasy. Even, I would say it trumps Lord of the Rings for me. Such a great kind of personal story about just this kid who grows up and tries to get vengeance, and the characters and the music especially, like, I don't think I've ever heard a movie score or even a video game score that beats, I think it's Basil Doris. He did the music. He's an incredible composer, and so yeah, that was the big one. Reading Sorcery, of course, after that was a huge influence and got me into, Conan and all that.
That's the one thing, sorry, I kind of want to go back to the soundtrack. I don't hear the Conan soundtrack talked that much about, but it's really up there with Star Wars and all those other great soundtracks. It's brilliant. Especially the when Conan is fighting, when there's that fight scene and you have the Latin choir going off. Oh my god. Like, it's such a good soundtrack that not only do I imagine the film, I imagine Howard writing the scenes. I think that's the music that would have played in Howard's head. So it really is. I have a very mixed opinion on the movie, because obviously I read Howard's work first, then I watched the film. I'm not sure how good of an adaptation it is. I'm not sure how good of a representation it is of Howard's work, but the things it does well, it does really well. Especially like some of the monologues, the Riddle of Steel monologue, flesh is stronger than steel, and unironically, when that king said, when jewels lose all its luster, that dialogue.
Comes the time, thief, when the jewels cease to sparkle, the gold loses its luster, when the throne room becomes a prison, all that is left is a father's love for his child.
I'm like, oh, that actually gave me goosebumps. I didn't expect that.
Yeah, exactly. But I absolutely agree. As an adaptation, it's far too big for starters. He's meant to be a little bubble light and wiry. But yeah, a lot of the way it hits and a greater world out there, and it leaves the story open-ended. Like, eventually he became king, but that's a story for another time. I think that's really cool. I think that's exactly how Howard wrote. It's about the greater world out there, but focused on the character first and foremost.
And that is something we did actually talk about before, is that I mentioned how when you read Lovecraft, it feels like you're unearthing something you shouldn't. You're reading like a manuscript or whatever, you're reading that. But with Howard, it very much felt like you were listening to a story being told. It had that story by the campfire vibe to it.
Yes. Like an oral story being told, around a campfire, I think is the best way to put it.
Right. And I guess, sort of, since Lovecraft was mentioned there, I guess with the world of Scars of Magic, there is that sort of that eldritch horror element to it too, right?
Yeah, there's a lot going on in the background. Creatures with different goals and different beginnings, and different kind of psyches, really, which our character comes across and has to deal with. And so it gets hinted at throughout the books, more so in books 3, 4, 5, 6. You start seeing the bigger picture and you're like, wait, there's actually a lot going on here. It's not just about this character going through, various craters and trying to make money as she can, but rather there is a big plot happening, not on the size of epic fantasy, but big in terms of what's going to happen with her and what all the creatures and what all the powers that be have in store for her as well.
I am actually really interested in her as a character. So she is essentially going into these craters and using the resources there to sell for profit, right? Is that her thing? Is that like her job? Is that what she does, or not really?
She gets along the first, there's so much more to her in terms of what happens. So obviously she's got a magic growth in her arm and spreading. She has to deal with. She has hope for a cure. She's also got various contacts around the world who she deals with. One enemy she makes soon turns out to be quite major, but it starts from like what do you call it, like an oyster or something. It slowly becomes a pearl. So the smallest things that I hit at in books 1 and 2 become major things. Kind of want to read to not necessarily pick those up on the first read through, and maybe on the second read through of the series I'll be like, whoa, it's all actually kind of preordained and kind of we had all the answers already, we just didn't know it. That's the kind of the mystery of Scars of Magic, which I really worked hard on, and which I really want to have that big payoff at the end. So yeah, there's a lot like that. In terms of book 2, that's when the found family aspect comes into it, and that's when she really finds her purpose in life. And she's no longer a wanderer at that stage, but she's actually wandering for a reason. She's got things to do, she's got, people to meet, and goals on her own. Book 1's very Sword and Sorcery in terms of, here's a wanderer, and you kind of get introduced to the world. But books 2 onwards is more of a full story.
That's pretty cool. So would you say this is a more personal story for you?
Not so much. The first books I wrote, The Aria of Steel, that's very much a personal story about, how to put it, let's just say I haven't had the easiest life. A lot of anger, which is reflected in the main character in there, which his name is Raziel. And that kind of growing up and trying to mature while you're trying to learn, how your emotions work and all of that. That was kind of the main thing for Aria of Steel. For Scars of Magic, yeah, I've matured a lot. I started writing it 10 years ago, changed a lot. I started a whole new career. I've been to university, all of that, second time around actually. And so there was a lot of change in how the character started and where she ended up at the end of book 6. Which, like I said, I've written already, so it's kind of, I've seen that progress happen, and it's been coloured by my own personal life. But I wouldn't say that Estera is me at all. She's very much her own entity. I think that's important for authors to eventually do. You can't just keep writing about yourself. You do have to, reflect your own personal beliefs and issues and stuff, of course. But I do think she's very much someone who I would want to be. but perhaps she ends up being someone that I would want to be.
Yeah. No, I understand. No, I think I phrased that question wrong. It's like obviously this isn't like a biography, and it wasn't like a character insert or anything like that. That's not, I hope that's not how I came across. Where I kind of realized that art, or at least like really good art, that you have to add a little bit of yourself into it. Was have you heard of the anime End of Evangelion? I'm not sure if you heard about that anime. End of Evangelion.
What up it?
Alright.
Why I stopped, and I do need to finish.
Okay. I would recommend you finishing it, and I would recommend you to watch the film. But without spoiling the film away, like, after the film, I was like, what the hell did I just watch? I was like, what on earth? And what I noticed is this is like a thing all people who've watched that show do. They like try and figure out what just happened. And I researched a lot about the creator of the show, which the name slips my mind. And like he was very, it's almost too personal. The amount that he puts into the movie, he almost reveals a little bit too much about himself and about his opinions. He's kind of like almost naked. He said he hated working on it almost. And it was sort of the third eye opening moment where it was like, oh yeah, you have. Some of the best art is personal and also honest. There has to be an honesty to it.
Yeah, I think it's tough to put that introspection into words, but there is a lot of my personality and stuff in there. I must say, as a younger person, I was very cynical and very, I did struggle with depression as well in the past, and so Mascara does deal with a lot of personal issues like that. It's important to put in there because mental health and mental well-being and stuff like that is very important to everyone in the world, and is becoming more important as people become aware of it. And put a lot of that into the character, and I think it makes it more relatable as well. And like I think I said to you before, Tolkien's characters, they're not very personable. They're not very, we're not intimate with Tolkien's characters. We don't really know what's going on in Frodo's head or in Aragorn's head at all. Because Tolkien is more archetypal author, as you said. So I really wanted to make the character believable. I wanted to make them relatable. And the main character is not perfect. I don't think any of the characters in the books are. I really wanted that anti-hero kind of grey area with grey morality, which I think is key to Sword and Sorcery. I really wanted that to resonate with readers and be present throughout the books.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that is the one thing that I also think makes Sword and Sorcery more applicable to our world. Because, we don't live in a world of pure good and pure evil necessarily. We live in a world of just grey. And I think people are very flawed. If we're talking about Sword and Sorcery, I think a perfect example of that is Elric. If you don't know anything about him, he does kind of come across as an asshole, At times he seems selfish almost. But once you read more into him, you understand him more, if that makes sense. It's like, if I was also in this really depraved society and my dad wasn't particularly all that great, I'd also be trying to look for a purpose, and a better meaning, no matter the cost. And I think that's sort of his mindset. And I think Sword and Sorcery, even more so than grim dark fantasy, because grim dark, that's very nihilistic. I'm not that big of a fan of that, but at least in Sword and Sorcery, there's that breathing room of trying to make these like flawed characters. I think flawed human characters.
Yeah, I'm not too big a fan of grim dark myself. I think the most grim dark thing I've ever read is Blood Meridian, actually, and it's horrible. So I think Sword and Sorcery got that kind of personal connection where they're just regular people just trying to get through a mess that they found themselves in. And like Conan, for example, he's not a good guy in many of the stories, but he's not also a bad guy in quite a few of the stories. He does save people and he does do good things. It's just doesn't really serve it himself in a kind of way. It's kind of always a bit of selfishness in there, a bit of, like you said, flawed humanity. That's what we need in characters if we want to connect with them truly.
Yeah, I know, and I think the one thing also on the subject of Conan that I do like about him is, for example, in the Tower of the Elephant, spoiler for a story that's like almost 100 years old, I guess, but like he doesn't gain anything Like, he doesn't achieve his original goal. He went to the tower to try and steal the jewel, but he felt some empathy for this strange creature that he found, that he was like, I have to be this arbiter of vengeance for this helpless creature. Even though he's, I think it's very heavily implied that he's really weirded out by it. But absolutely, I agree with you. You need that humanity flaw.
The description that Ari Howard uses for the, the elephant god, essentially, is so strange. I mean, anyone would be weirded out. And yet, Conan's empathy comes through, like you said, and I think that's really cool, because at first he's this greedy thief. By the end of the story, he's actually trying to do something good. And the whole point of his goal, like you said, is just gone. So he's got a totally new perspective on things. And I think that growth in such a short story is quite impressive, and it's a testament to his writing.
I think it's People of the Black Circle. That's another good one. With the Conan kidnaps this Indian princess to bargain with to free his own. Without rambling too far, basically this Indian princess goes from like this royalty to like the mountains of like Afghanistan or Afghanistan, I think it's what it's called. And she gets a lot of like tough love from Conan. She grows, and she actually saves Conan's life at the end. And Conan has this sort of mutual respect for this character that at first he didn't think much of. He kind of saw her as like a pawn in his game. Nah, those two human elements in there of Conan and that princess really do shine through, and that's awesome.
And I think that's kind of a hint at who R.E. Howard was, because he was actually quite a bit of a feminist for the time, 1920s, feminism was just getting into kind of, should we let women vote kind of stage. It's terrible to think of now. But he wrote female characters in the world where there's a lot of in an empathetic way, which, his counterpart Lovecraft kind of didn't really do too well. It's a kind of a sign of how progressive he actually was at the time, while he does still have his issues.
Yeah, with Howard, he's a difficult author, I think, because with Lovecraft, I think Lovecraft was just, you could even view him as being just a little bit snobbish, I guess. Whereas Howard, I think, was just interested in culture and with different people, and I feel that he was a little bit more empathetic. Yeah, and some of that obviously does still slip in, but, this is impossible to us to even comprehend, but I think you'd have, like, Confederate tea parties, like Confederate war veteran tea parties in the South. People who survive. That is nuts to think about. I don't even understand how they would even live in the same country. Like, just up the border, you had people who were fighting, and they had their own tea parties. It's crazy, and I think that does, that does influence you one way or another, but no, I agree. I think Howard had that empathy to it.
And I think he was a deeply emotional man. He had his own issues with depression and everything as well. So I think he understood that, and it seeped through into his writing, and that's what makes it so good today.
Right. A lot of people wonder, how is it that these words feel so lived in? Have you heard of the Rogues in the House podcast?
No.
Okay. I recommend you check them out, because one of them went to, I think it was Algeria, and he was talking about the bazaars there, right? And he was like, it is like I have walked into a world of Robert E. Howard, and it's like, how did he know this? He never traveled that far from Texas, let alone that part of the world. How is it so real? And I truly do believe that a lot of it was just he was reading a lot, but also he added a lot of his own personal experiences too into it.
Do you think that the fact that he never left Texas, really, and definitely never went to the Middle East or anything, and he's writing about these bazaars, and writing about the markets, and the customs, the religions, and all that, do you think that's why he's quite vague and quite mysterious over all that kind of world building? Which, ironically, makes it all the more interesting to us as readers.
You know what? I never thought of it like that, actually. No, you actually strike a good point. Because especially, like, when you look at, like, Kush and sort of the Black Kingdoms, as he calls them, they are the most vaguest because there was so little written about them. So I think that definitely does play a part. Never thought of it like that, actually. This is something I wanted to kind of go back into your world again, because you mentioned that it is sort of post-apocalyptic, right? So there is that post-apocalypse. Without obviously giving too much away, how does society sort of function? Is it like purely like Mad Max is basically a Wild West, or is there some order to it? Like, have you heard of the game Kenshi?
I've heard of it. I don't think I've played it.
Okay. It's it's a crazy game, but basically the plot is it's an apocalypse, a post-apocalypse, more on the sci-fi side of things. Humanity has regressed to sort of almost like a feudal Japan system. So there is order, there is law, but it's severely regressed to what it once was, which is probably like we had like machines or whatever. So how does like society function in this world of magic, magic craters with crystals in them?
Yeah. No, so travel is very restricted, obviously, because outside of the more civilized craters, it's just what? There's wastelands and there's floodlands and all sorts of weird places. That was actually one of the hardest parts of Scars Magic, was trying to pick up with something new in each crater, because I've got 45 stories, one or two of which taking place in the same place because it's a recurring a home base essentially, but the rest, each one I wanted to make very unique, so that was a bit of a challenge. But naturally travel again is very restricted, because people just can't fight every single monster they come across. So the main character is kind of an oddity at that, and they're kind of looked down upon a bit like The Witcher, how the witches in Witcher universe are very fell kind of people that no one wants to deal with. And so we've got the Traders' Circle is really the biggest kind of commercial hub of the world, and that's quite civilized. Like, they've got buildings, and they've started building up society again from the rubble. And it's less of a Mad Max kind of world and more of the bazaars and kind of stuff. They've kind of reached that level again, and they've got farms and things. Everything's kind of starting to work again. And in general, though, farmers are trying to just live and trying to survive outside of the civilized zones. And so there is a lot of suffering and stuff going on, and that's kind of informed by the realities of how cavemen used to live, and also how people in war zones live. So much out there where people do suffer and people do struggle through things, and yet they survive. And there are a lot of themes I wanted to explore which go along with the whole post-apocalyptic things, such as slavery and bigotry and all of that. So the stories do get dark, but the darkness isn't just out there in the wastes, it's also in civilized areas. Because as we know, wherever there's power and money to be had, people will do terrible things. To kind of build on Ari Howard's dislike, or not Ari Howard's dislike of civilization, but Conan's like of civilization and the various new evils that come with that. Because obviously, in any post-apocalyptic story, the question always is, how did such a great civilization and such a great world become like this? And A Canticle for Leibowitz is a great sci-fi novel by Walter M. Millen. And there, the whole question is, we had so much knowledge, we had so much wealth, we destroyed the entire world in an apocalypse, a nuclear apocalypse. And why did that happen? And, where do we go from here? And I wanted to kind of answer that in my own way for a magical apocalypse, and it seemed to work out. It's not too much like anything else I've read. It's not regressed all the way to kind of tribes and nomads and stuff like that, and it's kept a lot of civilization which once was. But there's a lot of wastelands to travel, and a lot of the wasteland isn't just deserts and stuff like that. There's jungles and beautiful places which the main characters go through. So I'm not sure if that quite answered your question.
No, that absolutely does. And but those themes, right? I mean, thankfully I don't think we're at a point of a nuclear apocalypse, but you kind of wonder, like, you look at like the pyramids or or even I've heard, I don't know if you've been hearing this, but I've been hearing a lot that they've been uncovering new sites in like in the Amazons. Like I think they just discovered a pyramid that they thought was a mountain, and for years people saw it in the sky and they thought it was a mountain, but no, it was just like it's a man-made structure, and it's like, how on earth did someone, what knowledge or what, I don't want to sound like a nut job, I'm not saying aliens built it or anything. Yeah. But you know what I mean. Like, how is that possible? And I think that's a motif that has been reoccurring throughout history. I think, and it's an important one to always, like, I don't know, humble ourselves and like go, okay, listen. There was a time where Greece existed and thought it would never fall. There was a time Babylon was a thing. There was a time when Rome was a thing. These things do collapse eventually, and what mistakes can we learn from those civilizations that will never happen again, or won't be as dramatic, I suppose.
Yeah, no. It's, you get devastation absolutely happens pretty much to every single empire in the world. And the way the world's structured at the moment is a very young, a very new development. If you look at the, Earth over the last 10, 20,000 years, we've only kind of just settled into this new arrangement we've got, and things are still changing. You just look at Ukraine, you look at Gaza, people are still fighting over the shapes of borders, and I don't think that will ever really end, because people are just like that, money, corruption.
My last question is, and I ask this to every author because I think this is an important question to ask, not just for reassurance, but just I think it's just an interesting question. It's like, what would you recommend to up and coming writers, people that are trying to be creative? I phrased this to Dariel in the last video, but like, what were the tips you tell your younger self about writing, I guess?
I would say read more, outline more. If that's the style, like I said, Stephen King does very well just writing by the seat of his pants, and he's brilliant at it. He's written 250 odd books, so if that works for you, go for it. But I have found outlining is very helpful. Have an end to the story and kind of work towards that, and learn from the books you read, because your own style, it doesn't develop in the first book or the first draft that you write. Your first draft will always be terrible. That's just a fact, which every author in the world will tell you. So if you can, put your first draft to the side, start working on your second book, or your third book, or your fourth book, and by the time you've got some experience in writing, go back, see if it's worthwhile. Sometimes it's not, and that's fine. Everything's a learning process, and nothing's wasted, I deleted multiple chapters and multiple stories in my life, and, they were trash, which is why I deleted them. But the learning process was there, and I learned a lot of good things about how I write and what I'm looking for in it, things that don't work for me. Like, I can't write big wars, I can't write epic fantasy, I just can't do that. It's not who I am, it's not what I'm interested in. And if an author isn't interested in what they're writing, then it's going to fail. I think you need to write about what you know and who you are, but in such a way that it's actually a fresh story that readers actually want to read. You have to strike that fine balance.
The last thing also is to just share your social media. Where can people find you? Where can people find more about your book, your other works, and to just follow you?
Yeah, so if you type my name into Google, you'll find pretty much everything. I'm pretty good with SEO, so I used to do a bit of web design as well. I've got a very jack of all trades kind of past. Yeah, if you Google my name, you'll find everything. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Blue Sky, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook, all the general sites. And Amazon is really a big one for my books. I'm not too difficult to find, it's just, yeah.
Thank you very much, Steven, once again. It was a pleasure speaking with you, and I'm happy we got this done.
Yeah, it's been a work in progress.
It really has been.
Great to talk to you. I really appreciate it, and yeah. I look forward to seeing the next videos you do.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll be looking forward for the next books you write, so. There you go. That's the end of the interview. I just want to thank Steven Raaymakers again for taking the time out of his day to come and have a talk with me. I don't normally do updates, but I did want to just put this out there at the end of this video. I am working on a project, and I won't say what it is, but it's pretty important to me, and it's been something I've been working on in the background. So yeah, look out for that. And yeah, thank you very much for watching again, and until our paths cross again, goodbye.